They say some kings are born from war, others from prophecy. But this king, the one who ruled the sleepless hours between dusk and dawn, was born from a single, terrible choice he made centuries ago and had regretted in silence ever since. To the world, he was a legend of fear, a shadow on castle walls, yet the truth was simpler and sadder. He was just a man who could no longer bear his own reflection. The vampire king sat alone on his throne of dark stone, in a hall lit only by trembling candle flames and the restless moon outside the stained glass windows. The castle was high in the mountains, where clouds rubbed against its towers like tired ghosts. To his subjects of the night, he was invincible, an immortal ruler with eyes like winter and a voice that made wolves fall silent. But inside his chest, beneath the hundreds of years of practiced calm, there was a quiet ache that never seemed to fade, no matter how many nights passed. He wore a crown of blackened silver that caught the faintest light, and a long midnight cloak that flowed like a moving shadow when he walked. His skin was pale, but not with the cruelty they whispered about in the villages below. It was the pale of someone who had watched too many sunrises from behind stone walls, never brave enough to step into the light. His eyes, a deep, impossible crimson, did not burn with hunger tonight. They were tired, reflective, almost gentle. On the long table beside his throne lay a folded letter, its edges softened by how many times he had held it. It smelled faintly of dried lavender and old ink. The letter had arrived weeks ago, carried by a trembling messenger who had almost fainted in his presence. He had read it in silence, his jaw tight, his fingers leaving small dents in the paper. Since then, he had not let anyone else touch it. "My lord," the chamberlain whispered from a respectful distance, his voice echoing faintly in the great hall. "The villagers wait at the base of the mountain. They ask for mercy. Again." The king did not answer immediately. He listened instead to the wind pressing against the stained glass, to the tap of rain beginning to fall on the roof high above. Mercy. It was a word he rarely heard in this castle, and yet it was the word that had haunted him since his first kill, centuries ago, when fear had ruled him more than any crown. "Send them food," he said at last, his voice calm, low, and steady. "And firewood, enough for a month. No one goes hungry under my sky." The chamberlain hesitated. "But my lord, that will." "Cost me." The king's lips curved into something that almost looked like a smile, but didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nothing that matters." The chamberlain bowed and backed away, relief mixing with confusion on his face. To the servants, the king's kindness was a mystery they did not dare question. To the outside world, it was a rumor no one believed. A merciful monster, a compassionate predator. The idea did not fit the legends. The king rose from his throne, each movement controlled, elegant, quiet. As he walked down the vast corridor, his footsteps made no sound. He passed old portraits of past rulers, some human, some not, faces frozen in arrogance and bloodlust. He did not look at them. He had long ago decided he would not be like them, no matter what the night had turned him into. Yet the letter on the table called him back in his mind. He could almost hear the voice behind the ink. He saw the nervous, slanted handwriting, the drops of water, tears, or rain, he could not be sure, staining some of the words. "You don't know me," the letter had begun, "but I think you know what it means to be afraid of what you are." He remembered that line as clearly as if it were spoken in his ear. It had caught him off guard, like an arrow piercing armor he believed was unbreakable. No one wrote to him like this. They wrote begging for safety, for protection, for power, for gold. But this letter had not asked for any of those things. It had asked for something far more dangerous. It had asked him to care. The king reached a narrow balcony and stepped outside. The night air was cold and damp, wrapping around him like an old friend. Far below, the lights of the village flickered weakly against the dark, small and fragile. He knew what they thought of him. Parents used his name to frighten children into obedience. Elders told stories of his ancient cruelty. Priests cursed his existence in their quiet prayers. And yet, he had saved those same villagers from invading armies, from famine, from plagues that crawled up the mountain like invisible smoke. He had done it silently, always from the shadows, never expecting gratitude. Perhaps, he thought, that was his punishment, to protect a world that would never trust him, to be a guardian dressed in the clothes of a monster. A distant howl rose from the forest below, then another, closer, more desperate. His sharp ears picked it up easily. Not a wolf. A human voice, hoarse and breaking, carried by the wind. Help. The king's body reacted before his mind did. The call sliced through the practiced calm he wore over his soul. It wasn't only the word that struck him, it was the sound of it. The voice was young, but already exhausted, frayed at the edges like it had been screaming silently for years. He gripped the cold stone of the balcony railing, feeling something stir inside him, an old instinct, but not the one people feared. This was not hunger. This was recognition, pain calling to pain. Again, the letter flashed in his memory. I write to you because no one believes me, because no one listens. They only tell me to be quiet, to be strong, to accept what is happening. But it hurts, and I can't hide it forever. The howl for help came again, closer now. This time there was another sound underneath it, a harsh crack, like a body hitting something hard. The king's eyes sharpened, narrowing as he focused on the tree line. His senses stretched out, past the walls, into the rain and the mist. He saw movement, someone running, stumbling, falling. He did not think, he simply moved. In an instant, his body dissolved into a rush of cold wind and black mist, flowing down from the balcony like a shadow cut free from its owner. The castle flickered past in a blur, stone, iron, torchlight, all forgotten. There was only the forest, the voice, and that strange, painful tug in his chest that would not let him stay still. He reached the trees and reformed at their edge, his boots sinking slightly into wet earth. The forest was dark, but to his eyes everything was clear. The silver lining of leaves, the shine of raindrops, the shaking figure of a young human collapsed near a fallen log. It was a girl, no older than 17, her clothes torn, her breathing ragged. Her hair was soaked and clinging to her face. There was mud on her hands, on her knees, and something else, too. Dark marks on her skin, peeking out from her sleeves and collar. Marks that did not belong to the forest. The king took one careful step toward her, his movements slow and non-threatening, as if approaching a wounded animal. Do not be afraid, he said softly, his voice a low echo between the trees. You are safe now. The girl flinched at the sound, trying to push herself backward, but her arms trembled too much. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes widened, not in the wide, mindless terror he was used to, but in a different kind of shock, like she was seeing a ghost she had once believed in and then stopped. You're real, she whispered, her voice breaking. They said you were a monster. He knelt to her level, the rain quietly tapping on his cloak, his eyes never leaving her face. He could smell blood, faint, old, and layered. Not from a single wound, but from many healed and reopened again and again. Sometimes, he answered honestly, his gaze softening. Sometimes I have been. Her lips trembled. For a moment, he thought she would scream or run or plead for her life. Instead, she did something that pierced him far more deeply. She laughed, a small, humorless sound that turned quickly into a sob. If you're a monster, she said, her voice shaking, then why do you look kinder than the people who did this to me? She tried to stand and her sleeve slid down her arm. The king saw the bruises then, dark, blooming, cruel. They were not the marks of an accident nor of a single moment of anger. They were a pattern, a history. For the first time in centuries, the night around him seemed to tilt. His breath caught, even though he did not need air. A cold stillness settled in his chest, deeper than any hunger, heavier than any curse. The stories they told about him, the bloodshed, the terror, the darkness, felt suddenly small and distant, like childish drawings compared to the quiet violence written on this girl's skin. He reached out a hand, then stopped it just inches from her arm, his fingers trembling with a hesitation he was not used to feeling. He had the strength to shatter stone, to stop armies, to halt a storm mid-sky. But in that moment, he was afraid of touching her, of breaking what little strength she had left, of what this would awaken inside his own heart. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, but carrying the weight of a king, of centuries, of a promise forming in the cold air. The girl looked at him, rain and tears mixing on her cheeks, her answer stuck in her throat. Her hand moved not to point at the forest, not toward some distant danger, but slowly, shakily, back toward the village. "Please," she breathed as her body began to sway, consciousness slipping away. "Don't send me back there." Her eyes rolled closed, and she collapsed forward. The vampire king caught her gently before she hit the ground, her head resting against his chest, her small frame light in his arms. For a long moment, he knelt there in the rain, holding a stranger whose pain felt strangely, painfully familiar. The night was very quiet now. Even the wind seemed to be waiting. He looked up toward the distant glow of the village lights, his jaw tightening, his crimson eyes darkening with something fierce and unspoken. The words from the letter rang in his mind again, clearer than ever. "I can't hide it forever." He realized, with a strange, freezing certainty, that this girl and the writer of that letter were not strangers to each other, and perhaps not strangers to him, either. As the rain fell harder and the forest held its breath, the vampire king rose to his feet, the unconscious girl cradled carefully in his arms, caught between the monster they say he was and the protector he did not yet know how to be. They say that some moments arrive so quietly, you only realize your life has changed when you look back. For the vampire king, it was that simple weight in his arms, a trembling human girl who had collapsed against his chest, that cracked something open inside a heart he had once believed was stone. As he carried her through the forest, rain sliding down his face like borrowed tears, he knew he was crossing an invisible line he had vowed never to touch again. The girl's breathing was shallow but steady, her head against his shoulder, her fingers curled weakly in the fabric of his cloak, as if, even unconscious, she was still afraid of being dropped, of being left alone. He moved through the trees with effortless speed, his steps silent on wet leaves, the dark sky overhead rumbling with distant thunder. Night animals watched him pass and turned away, sensing something in him that was older than the mountains and more complicated than fear. By the time he reached the hidden gate of the castle, the rain had softened to a mist. The ancient iron bars lifted at his presence, creaking low in greeting, and he stepped into the inner courtyard, where the torches flickered faintly against the stone walls. The guards, shadows in armor, stiffened as they saw the figure in his arms, their hands twitching toward weapons they knew they would never dare raise against their king. "My lord, a human," one of them whispered. "Not a threat," the king answered, his tone leaving no room for question. "She is under my protection now." The word protection echoed strangely in the quiet yard. Rumors would spread, he knew. Servants talked, guards talked, but for once he did not care. Let them whisper that their king had gone soft, that he had brought prey into the nest. Let them question. He had lived too long worried about what people called him. Monster, savior, curse. None of those labels meant anything when you were faced with someone who had nowhere safe to go. He took her not to the dungeon, not to some cold guest chamber, but to a small room near his own quarters, a room that smelled faintly of old books and clean linen, where the windows faced the east but were shaded by thick curtains. A room that had not been used in years. Gently, he laid her on the bed and stepped back, watching her for a moment. Her face, in sleep, looked younger but no less haunted. Up close, the bruises were clearer, along her neck, her wrists, her shoulders. They formed silent sentences no one had ever let her speak aloud. A knock came at the door. One of the castle healers, an older woman with silver-threaded hair and kind, observant eyes, entered with a basin of warm water and clean cloths. "You never bring anyone here," she said quietly, glancing from the king to the girl. There was no fear in her gaze, only curiosity and a soft compassion that reminded him why he had kept her in his service for so long. "Who is she?" "Someone who needs to be believed," he answered simply. The healer nodded, as if that was all she needed to know. She moved quickly, gently cleaning the mud from the girl's face and hands, her touch steady and respectful. The king watched every motion, his jaw tight, his fingers unconsciously curling against the stone wall. "These marks," the healer murmured, being careful not to expose more of the girl's body than necessary. "They are old and new layered. This did not happen in one night. Whoever did this did it often." Heat rose in the king's chest, but not the heat of hunger or rage that people feared. This was something more controlled, more focused. A slow, deep anger at a world that allowed this kind of pain to exist in the quiet corners of ordinary lives. A world that would easily hate him, a creature of the night, while turning its head away from the cruelty of its own daylight. "Will she recover?" he asked. The healer studied the girl's face, then nodded. "Her body, yes, with rest. Her spirit, that will depend on what happens next." When the healer finally left, the king remained by the doorway, watching the girl's chest rise and fall. He stayed there longer than he intended, until the candles burned low and the wind outside shifted, carrying the first hint of approaching dawn. Then, just as he turned to leave, her voice broke the silence. "Don't," she whispered, her eyes still closed, her fingers clenching the blanket. "Please, I'll be good, I promise. I won't say anything." He froze, then slowly stepped closer. "You are not in that place anymore," he said softly, his tone careful, as if speaking too loudly might shatter her. "You are in my home. No one here will hurt you." Her eyes fluttered open, heavy with exhaustion and confusion. For a moment, she looked at the ceiling, her mind trying to decide if this was another nightmare. Then she turned her head and saw him, his tall figure framed by the dim candlelight, his crimson eyes steady and strangely gentle. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, her voice rough, the question too tired to hide its suspicion. She swallowed hard. "What do you want from me?" The king held her gaze. People had asked him for centuries what he wanted: power, blood, gold, loyalty. Those were easy questions. This one was not. "I heard you call for help," he said, "and I refuse to ignore it. That is all." "No one helps for nothing," she muttered, looking away. "Especially not you." There was no hatred in her voice when she said it, just a worn-out certainty. She had grown up on stories of him, he realized, the same stories that painted him as the nightmare at the edge of the forest. Yet she had still spoken to him more honestly in a few sentences than most nobles had in entire lifetimes. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then quietly, "Liora." He repeated it in his mind, the syllables soft, almost like light. "Liora," he said aloud, as if anchoring her here with that single word. "You are under my protection now. You do not owe me anything." Her eyes widened slightly, confusion mixing with something else. Something wary, fragile, like hope trying to decide if it was safe to exist. "That letter," he continued carefully, "the one that arrived weeks ago, was it from you?" Leora's lips parted in shock, her hands, still bruised, twisted in the blanket. "You read it." Every word. A flush of shame and anger crossed her face. "I shouldn't have written it. It was stupid. The others laughed at me when they saw the address. 'The Vampire King,' they said. 'Why not write to the storm or the river while you're at it?' They said even if you were real, you wouldn't care about someone like me." He felt something twist inside him. "And yet," he said slowly, "you wrote it anyway. I was desperate, she whispered, her voice splintering, and tired of pretending the bruises were accidents, tired of people telling me to stay quiet, to forgive, to understand. They said I should be grateful I even had a home. She let out a bitter breath. So I wrote to the only monster everyone was honest about. She looked back at him then, her gaze searching his face, trying to match the legend with the man standing before her. I thought if you were as cruel as they said, maybe you would destroy the village and I wouldn't have to go back, she admitted. And if you were, maybe you would just listen. Just once. Just somebody listening would have been enough. Silence settled between them, heavy but not empty. The king felt the weight of her words pressing against centuries of his own choices. He thought of all the times he had turned away from the pain of humans, believing it was not his place to interfere with their lives as long as they did not threaten his realm. He had told himself it was mercy, to stay distant, to let them live and die by their own hands. But now, looking at Liora, he saw the flaw in that calm philosophy. Some monsters did not have fangs or claws. Some monsters walked in daylight and were welcomed at tables and given titles like father or uncle or neighbor. He had stayed away from humanity to avoid becoming their nightmare again. In doing so, he had left them alone with their own nightmares. That was not stupid, he said at last, his voice quiet but firm. Writing that letter was courage. Coming into this forest alone was courage. Calling for help, even when you believed no one would listen, that was courage, too. Her eyes filled, not with the wild, panicked tears of fear, but with the slow, heavy ones of someone who had been strong for too long. You don't know what they'll do if I stay away, she whispered. They'll say I'm ungrateful, that I'm a liar, they won't believe me, they never do, and if I go back. She stopped, her throat closing on the rest. He took a step closer, until he was standing beside her bed, the edge of his cloak brushing the floor. Then you will not go back, he said simply. Liora stared at him. You can't just decide that. I am the king of these mountains, he replied. My word decides many things, this will be one of them. She laughed again, that same cracked, half-disbelieving sound he had heard in the forest. They'll hate you for it. They already do. He allowed himself a small, honest smile. They have hated me for longer than you have been alive. It has never stopped me from doing what I believe is right. Her expression softened just a little, but the fear did not disappear, it only shifted. And what if, she asked quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket, what if you change your mind? What if you decide I'm too much trouble? What if you get tired of me? For a second, the question took him back, far back, to another time, another face, another pair of frightened eyes asking him for safety. He had failed that person. He had watched them be taken from him because he had hesitated, too afraid of his own nature to fully shield them. Not again. He lowered himself to sit carefully on the edge of the chair near her bed, making his tall frame as unthreatening as possible. The candlelight flickered between them, softening the angles of his face. Liora, he said, letting her name steady him, I have lived long enough to grow tired of many things. Power, politics, fear. But I have never grown tired of those who are brave enough to seek kindness in a world that has denied it to them. If you stay here, you will not be a burden to me. You will be a reminder of what kind of king I choose to be. Her lips trembled. What kind is that? The kind who does not turn away, he answered. For the first time, something like safety flickered in her eyes. It was small, shaky, but it was there. Before either of them could say more, a loud knock echoed on the chamber door. It was firm, urgent. The king's head turned, his eyes instantly sharpening, every sense alert. Enter, he called. The door opened, and one of his scouts stepped in, cloak damp with mist, boots still streaked with mud from the mountain path. He bowed quickly, then looked up, his face pale. My lord, he said, glancing nervously at Liora before forcing his eyes back to the king. "The village has sent a delegation. They demand an audience. They say," he swallowed, "they say you have stolen one of their own." Liora stiffened, her hands clutching the blanket so tightly her knuckles went white. Her breath hitched, and the color drained from her face at the word stolen. The king rose slowly to his full height, the room seeming to narrow around him. But when he spoke, his voice was calm, colder than the night air outside, but steady as stone. "Tell them I will meet them in the great hall," he said. "No one enters this wing without my permission. No one speaks to her without my presence. No one touches her. Is that understood?" "Yes, my lord." The scout hurried out. Silence settled again, heavier now, pressing into the corners of the room. Liora looked at the king, fear and guilt twisting together in her eyes. "They'll say I lied," she whispered. "They always do, and if they see me here." "They will not," he interrupted gently. "You will stay here, safe. You do not have to face them alone anymore." She shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "They're my family," she choked out, the word clearly tangled with hurt. "And you're a monster," he finished for her, but his tone held no accusation, only weary honesty. She looked at him, her tears catching the candlelight. Then, slowly, she shook her head. "You're the only one who believed me," she whispered. "Whatever they say, that has to mean something." Something shifted behind his eyes at her words, like a storm rolling in across a still lake. For centuries, he had carried his sins alone, his small acts of goodness hidden in shadows, as if he did not deserve to be seen doing anything but harm. But now, here was this broken, brave human girl, looking at him not with the blind fear of legend, but with the cautious trust of someone who had nothing left to lose. It settled over him like a new kind of crown, not of blackened silver, but of responsibility he chose, willingly, this time. "It means," he said quietly, standing in the doorway, "that I cannot fail you." He stepped out of the room and closed the door gently behind him, leaving Liora in the soft, flickering quiet. Outside, the castle corridors buzzed with low whispers, tension coiling through the air like a drawn bowstring. Down in the great hall, torches were being lit, banners straightened, seats prepared. The vampire king walked toward the hall with measured steps, his cloak flowing behind him like a shadow that had finally decided which side it wished to stand on. Each stone he passed seemed to remember old battles, old screams, old choices. Tonight, something different would be written into its memory. When he pushed open the enormous doors, the delegation from the village was already there, 3 men and 2 women, dressed in their best clothes, eyes filled with a mixture of dread and anger. Behind them, a young priest clutched a wooden charm in trembling hands, whispering protective prayers under his breath. One of the men stepped forward. Leora's face flashed in the king's mind, where the bruises had been darkest, where the fear had sunk the deepest, and the resemblance was immediate. His jaw, his eyes, the set of his shoulders. "Your Majesty," the man said, forcing respect through clenched teeth. "I am Leora's father." The hall seemed to hold its breath. The vampire king descended the steps from his throne slowly, his gaze never leaving the man's face. "And why," he asked, his voice calm and dangerously quiet, "does a father come to my door accusing me of theft, when it is his own hands that have left bruises on his daughter's skin?" Elia's expression flickered, shock cutting through his anger for a heartbeat before hardening back into defensive outrage. "That girl lies," he snapped. "She is troubled, ungrateful. She runs into the forest in the middle of the night and now hides behind you to avoid responsibility. She belongs to us. Return her, and we will deal with her as we see fit." His words hung in the air, sharp and bitter. The other villagers shifted uneasily, some nodding in agreement, others looking down, unable to meet the king's eyes. For a long moment, the hall was absolutely still. Then, slowly, the king smiled, not the cold, cruel smile from the stories, but something gentler, more sorrowful, and far more dangerous. "No," he said. The word was soft, but it rang through the hall like a bell. Elia's face darkened. "You dare to interfere in our family matters. You, eh?" "Choose your next word carefully," the king interrupted, his eyes flashing. "You stand in my home, under my roof, and you speak of family matters." He took another step forward. "Tell me, Elias, when you raised your hand against your daughter, was that also a family matter? When you ignored her tears, when you painted your cruelty as discipline, was that what you call love?" Elias opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The villagers behind him shifted again, discomfort growing more visible on their faces. "You call me a monster," the king continued, his voice low, his tone even, but every word precise, "because it is easier than admitting what hides in your own homes. I have killed in war. I have spilled blood on battlefields. I do not deny what I am." He took another step, now only a few paces away. "But I have never, in all my centuries, laid a hand on someone who trusted me. I have never used love as a weapon." The priest cleared his throat nervously. "With respect, my lord, the girl is human. She belongs with her people." "She belongs," the king said, turning his gaze slightly, "where she is believed, where she is safe, where the hands that touch her do not leave scars." He looked back at Elias. "She wrote to me, you know, a letter sent in secret. She asked not for revenge, not for blood, but simply to be heard, to be seen. You had that chance first. You chose to silence her instead." Elias' fists clenched. "She is my blood." "And she is my responsibility now," the king replied. The hall buzzed with a low murmur. The villagers were not used to seeing their nightmare argue not with teeth and claws, but with truth. Slowly, some of their fear began to mix with something else, uneasy self-reflection, a quiet question of their own stories. One of the older women in the group stepped forward, her face lined with years and weather. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted them. "My lord," she said, her voice softer, "if we let her stay, what will the others think? That we are weak, that we have no control over our own people." The king regarded her for a moment. Then he walked to the base of the steps and placed his hand lightly on the stone rail. "Perhaps," he said, "they will think that you value mercy more than pride, that you have the courage to admit when you were wrong, that you no longer protect abusers simply because they share your blood or your roof." His voice gentled. "The question is not what they will think of you. The question is, what will the children in your village learn from this? That their pain matters or that it does not." The woman's eyes grew wet. She looked at Elias, at the priest, at the others. None of them seemed to have an easy answer. "You cannot keep her here forever," Elias spat at last, his pride still standing where his arguments had fallen. "One day she will see what you are and come crawling back. When that day comes, we will remember your interference." The king held his gaze. "If she ever decides to leave, it will be her choice. Not yours, not mine, hers. And if she goes back to you, I pray you will have learned by then what love is supposed to feel like." Elias turned away with a snarl of frustration, signaling the others to follow. As they left the hall, the old woman glanced back once, her eyes meeting the king's. There was confusion there and worry, but also, faintly, gratitude. Or maybe it was relief that someone else had finally said what none of them had been brave enough to. When the doors closed behind the delegation, the hall fell into deep, echoing silence. The vampire king stood alone for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the cold stone, his shoulders square but heavy. He knew this was not the end. Gossip would spread. Some would say he had stolen a child. Others would say he had saved one. Both versions would change the way the villages spoke his name. He found that he did not mind. Slowly, he turned and walked back through the corridors, past the portraits, past the watching servants. When he reached Liora's door, he paused, then knocked softly. "Come in," her faint voice answered. He entered. She was sitting up now, a blanket pulled around her shoulders, her eyes puffy but clearer. When she saw his face, she searched it quickly, as if trying to read the outcome in the lines around his eyes. "Well," she asked, her voice small. He closed the door behind him and leaned lightly against it, a strange, almost shy warmth touching the edges of his expression. "They came," he said. "They shouted, they threatened, they insisted you belonged to them." Liora's fingers tightened around the blanket. "And you?" "I told them no." Her breath left her in a ragged rush, as if she had been holding it since the moment he walked out. Her shoulders sagged, her eyes filling again, but this time the tears were different, softer, disbelieving. "You mean I can really stay?" she whispered. "If you wish," he replied. "No one will force you to return. No one will touch you without your consent, not while I still draw breath." She laughed on a sob, brushing at her cheeks with the back of her hand. "You don't even breathe," she pointed out weakly. He gave a faint, amused nod. "Then consider it a stronger promise." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The candles hummed quietly. The distant dawn tried to press against the thick curtains but could not break through. This small room, for all its simplicity, felt like the center of the world. "Why?" she asked again, but this time the word was softer, less about suspicion and more about wonder. "Why do you care so much? You don't even know me." He thought about answering with something simple, something easy. But he had promised himself he would not lie anymore, not to her, not to himself. "Because once," he said slowly, his voice dipping into a quieter, older place, "a long time ago I knew someone who begged me for protection. I hesitated. I convinced myself it was not my place. I watched the world take them from me." He met her eyes. "I have regretted that choice every night since. When I saw your bruises, when I heard your voice in that forest, I recognized the same fear. This time I will not stand aside." Liora looked at him, really looked, as if seeing past the fangs and the red eyes and the immortal myth to the man underneath. The silent guilt, the quiet determination. "Then maybe," she said, a tremor in her voice but also a strange kind of strength, "you're not the monster everyone says you are." He tilted his head slightly. "And maybe," he answered, "you are far stronger than everyone says you are." They shared a small, fragile smile, one worn thin by pain but real. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, glancing at the curtains hiding the rising sun, "you rest, you heal. You learn what it feels like to exist in a place where you do not have to be afraid. After that, we will decide together." "Together," she repeated, as if testing the word. It sounded new on her tongue, but not unwelcome. He moved to the door, then paused, turning back. "Liora." "Yes. If, one day, others come to you the way you came to me, hurt, afraid, unheard, will you do for them what I am trying to do for you now?" Her eyes widened a little. No one had ever asked her to be anything but quiet, obedient, invisible. For the first time, someone was asking her to be strong for others. She straightened her shoulders, just slightly, the blanket still wrapped around her but no longer hiding her completely. "I'll try," she said. "I don't know how yet, but I'll try." He nodded, something like pride flickering in his gaze. "That," he said, opening the door, "is all courage ever is." As he stepped into the corridor, the castle seemed just a little different, the shadows less heavy, the silence less lonely. The vampire king walked away from her room not as a predator returning to his throne, but as a guardian returning to his watch. Outside, the dawn rose unseen behind thick clouds, the village below waking to its usual routines, whispering new rumors about the monster in the mountains who had dared to defy a father for his daughter's sake. Some told the story in fear, some in anger, a few, quietly, in gratitude. And in a small, quiet room in the heart of a stone castle, A girl with fading bruises and a letter's worth of courage closed her eyes, not in fearful exhaustion, but in something that, for the first time in her life, felt like real rest. From that night on, the legends began to change, just a little. They still said the Vampire King walked the halls at midnight. They still said he ruled the darkness. But now, if you listened closely, if you spoke to the children and the wounded and the ones whose pain had been forgotten, you might hear a different version. They would tell you that when the Vampire King saw the Bruises, midnight stopped being his kingdom and became his promise. His curse was no longer the hunger that haunted him, but the burden he willingly chose. To never again look away from the quiet sufferings of the world he once watched from a distance. And to make sure that, under his sky, no one's wounds would ever be invisible again.